Hi everyone. Today we are diving into NAD+. It's got a lot of hype going on online, but it's not just a trend. It's actual biology. This is a molecule that our cells need to make energy. And if it dropped to zero, we'd be done within seconds. It's required for our metabolism and for life. So today we're going to do a full deep dive on what NAD+ is, more of a explanation of why it matters, why it declines with age, and what are the different boosting strategies that are available. It's not necessarily as a sales pitch, it's just to explain the biology, and we're going to really go into the science. We're going to cover the NAD cycle and why it's required for life, what are NR and NMN and niacin, and why there are more studies on those, and what we do and don't know about NAD+ injections. We're going to cover oral precursors versus injectable, pros and cons, why NAD declines with age. So we'll talk about things like sirtuins, CD38, PARP, NNMT. And finally, what are the common side effects that people report with injections, like fatigue, headaches, and what might be going on there physiologically. So the high level takeaway is that NAD is foundational biology, and the smartest approach is to understand the system, to lower that burn rate, and to support the rebuilding. Before we dive in, just a quick intro so you know where I'm coming from. I'm Christy. I'm a PhD scientist. I've spent the last 25 years studying molecular biology and especially cancer genetics, and this is genuinely my wheelhouse. I love talking about peptides and longevity, and that's kind of my jam. So I'm not a medical doctor. I don't treat patients, not here to diagnose or prescribe anything. What I do bring is a deep training in molecular pathways and how to read and interpret primary literature. That's what my career has been built on. And since there's a lot of chatter and confusion and misinformation online about NAD, my goal is just to simplify it all, take out the hype, walk you through the science and the actual biology using the published research as my foundation. We're going to start at the beginning. What is NAD? Why is it required for life? First of all, NAD stands for nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide and essentially has two core jobs. Number one is energy metabolism. So NAD is essential for energy production because it carries electrons. It's very simple, actually. It exists in two main forms, NAD+ and NADH. The H stands for hydrogen. So NAD+ is the empty form and NADH is the charged form. When your cells break down glucose, fatty acids, amino acids, things like, metabolism, that's where NAD picks up electrons and then it becomes NADH. And then NADH delivers those electrons into the mitochondrial energy system, and that helps generate ATP. ATP, that's the energy currency of the cell. I'm sure you've heard of it. And if NAD disappears, you can't run your metabolism. So no energy production, and then life would cease to exist. And that's why I say if NAD hit zero, you'd be done. Now, the second job is as a signaling molecule that gets consumed. So NAD isn't only recycled like a battery, it's also used up or consumed by certain enzymes that are involved in DNA maintenance and DNA repair. This includes PARP enzymes. These are involved in DNA damage response and basically signaling the repair of that DNA. And then also through sirtuins, these are involved in metabolic regulation and stress signaling. You might have heard of them as like longevity molecules, and that's kind of how they're well known. And then we also have CD38. This is an enzyme that's expressed on certain immune cells, and it actually breaks down NAD. So we'll get into why that's important in a little bit. So NAD is doing two things simultaneously. It's constantly cycling to make energy, and then it's constantly being consumed for this repair and signaling. And when we start to think about this, we'll understand why it starts to decrease with age. But all this means is that your body has to constantly rebuild NAD, and this is NAD economy, as I like to call it. So let's talk about the NAD cycle first before we get into that in plain English. So step number one is we have NAD+, right? That gets converted back and forth between NADH and NAD+. So during metabolism, NAD+ becomes NADH, and then NADH becomes NAD during ATP production. That's the energy cycle. Part two is where NAD gets consumed by maintenance enzymes. So when PARP or sirtuins use up NAD, they break it and they generate a byproduct called nicotinamide. Nicotinamide is also called NAM. So NAD is consumed and that produces NAM. The salvage pathway then rebuilds NAD. Your body can recycle this NAM back into NAD. That's the salvage pathway. So when we talk about that, that's what that means, essentially breaking something down into components and then using those components to build that same thing back. And that same thing is NAD. And this is key because it explains why so many NAD strategies kind of converge. All right, so whether we start with NAD, NR, or NMN, or niacin, a lot of the story ends up being fed into that same rebuilding machinery. The central idea is that NAD is constantly being cycled, spent, and rebuilt. This is where whenever I post about NAD, I get a lot of comments that say that NR is better than NMN or NMN is better than NAD. There's always these kind of preferences, and we'll get into that. I think preference is fine, but I'd like to kind of counter argue that they're all equally good. So here's the truth. There's different entry points into the same NAD rebuilding network. We have NR, nicotinamide riboside. That's a precursor that can enter cells and be converted into NMN, and then that gets converted into NAD. So NR, NMN, NAD. NMN, nicotinamide mononucleotide, that's one step closer to NAD. So NMN to NAD. There's just ongoing debate about how NMN enters cells directly in different tissues, but mechanistically, a well-supported route is that NMN can be processed outside of the cells and still feed NAD production inside the cells. Then we have niacin. This is nicotinic acid. So niacin is another precursor that can be used for NAD production. It has a long history in human research because it's been used in medicine for decades, especially in lipid research. But the important point is that we have more human studies on NR and NMN and niacin than we do on NAD plus injections. They're easy to study as oral supplements. Dosing and compliance are simple. They've been commercially available longer in standardized forms. So when someone says there's more evidence for NMN than injections, I would completely agree with them. This is completely true, but in terms of volume of human data. But that doesn't automatically mean that injections don't make sense biologically. It just means we have less clinical trial data. But we do know a lot about NAD, and so let's get into that. Let's talk about the kind of outcomes that NAD precursors have been studied for. I'm going to keep this high integrity. I'm not telling you that these treat diseases. I'm just saying what they've been studied for and why. Cardiovascular and metabolic markers. NAD intersects with endothelial function, mitochondrial metabolism, oxidative stress signaling, inflammation pathways. So researchers study NAD precursor effects on metabolic efficiency, insulin sensitivity markers, vascular function and cardiovascular markers, and brain health and aging. So the brain is a very energy demanding organ, and mitochondrial function matters a lot for that. So, anything that matters for energy is really important for the brain. And NAD also intersects with neuronal energy and metabolism, and of course, DNA repair and cellular stress pathways. We've already touched on that. And it also is involved in inflammatory signaling. So NAD boosting strategies show up in research that's related to cognitive aging, neural inflammation, and even in models of neurodegeneration. Now, a key point here is that the evidence is still developing, but mechanistically, NAD is central to why these are even plausible targets. So I look at it like this. We have foundational biology plus emerging clinical translational research. Now, people always ask about dosing, so let's talk about that. Now, I'm not your doctor. I'm not giving medical dosing instructions, but I can share the ranges that are commonly used in the studies and in clinical wellness contexts. Now, in oral precursors, obviously you're going to purchase that from a company and it's going to be labeled on the bottle. Those are typically milligram to gram contacts. So we usually have some of the studies are 500 milligrams to a gram, taking it twice a day as 500 milligrams. So it's going to depend on which compound we're talking about in the context, but just general speaking. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because the oral route involves digestion and first pass metabolism. So we are taking more of these precursors in an oral form, right? Because what's going to become usable, there's going to be a lot of loss of that molecule as it goes through digestion. So that I'm bringing that up to introduce injections and why I kind of maybe slightly prefer that. So now there's less evidence, of course, but biological plausibility. Let's talk about the NAD plus injections. Okay, first up, do we have as many human studies on injectable NAD compared to NR/NMN? No, absolutely not. You don't need to come at me in the comments. I know that. But does it make biological sense that NAD injections could still support intracellular NAD? That's the question that I personally was asking because I wanted to know. And I would say the answer is yes, because of the salvage pathway. Even if NAD itself doesn't diffuse into cells intact, which I would agree is large, is probably not happening. But we know it can be broken down into smaller components, and then those components can be transported into cells and rebuilt into NAD. That's that salvage pathway. That's the logic, right? So if someone comments that NAD injections are useless, my counter argument is like, that's not biologically a very strong argument because we do have this evidence of the salvage pathway. It's just not a very strong argument from a biological standpoint. No shade. Now, the more honest statement, and I think, sometimes we just type things out really quickly. I get it. I'm really not coming at you. I'm just saying yes, what you really meant to say is we have less clinical trial literature on injections. I would agree with that. It's just a different claim. And also the route matters. IV injections, they can deliver a large amount very quickly. Sub-Q, typically smaller amounts, more gradual exposure, very practical for home use, but also it's a much smaller amount than what's delivered in the oral formulations. We're talking, maybe 10 to 100 milligrams versus 1,000 milligrams. So different tools, different contexts, neither one is superior. I think they're both valid and both really great options. But let's compare them clearly. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons. So oral NR, NMN, and niacin. So yes, more published human studies always suggesting that there are really nice, tremendous benefits from utilizing these compounds. So I'm a huge fan. It's also easy and it's easy and you can consistently use it daily if you're someone that likes to take supplements. There's no injections. There's very few side effects. I don't even think there were really any reported side effects. So maybe some GI stuff, but very, very minor, and very few people report any type of side effects. So smoother tolerance for many people. Those are all positives. Now, on the con side, we know that it has to go through first pass digestion and go through the gut and the liver, first pass metabolism. So we need higher doses, and then some people don't really feel it as much. There could be a little GI sensitivity for some people, and the results may be slower or more subtle. Those cons aren't a big deal, but just kind of measuring up. Now let's talk about injections. So bypasses the stomach, bypasses the liver, smaller amount. Most people feel it more noticeably. And this is really great for people who want acute support, or they don't tolerate oral, they don't want to, take more supplements. And if you're already doing injections, it can be very practical because it's just, if you don't really mind injections. It's probably not most people, but people in the peptide world don't mind. So now the cons for injections are there are just fewer studies compared to oral precursors. The side effects can be more common, especially if it's highly dosed or delivered too fast. And it might cost a little bit more. I think it's pretty, if you're looking at a good quality precursor supplement, I think the pricing is pretty similar. Response can vary. Now, my personal stance is that I think they're both valid strategies, and it really just depends on your goals, your tolerance, and what you'll do consistently, because the main point I'm really trying to make is that both are great options. And I think that supporting these pathways is really important for most people as we age, and we'll get into who benefits the most, but so whatever works for you, that's all I'm saying. Now let's talk about aging, because this is sort of the core of the discussion. So NAD declines with age, not because your body forgets how to make it. It's actually declining because of that economy change that I mentioned earlier. We're spending more and we're not as efficient at rebuilding it. So let's talk about why. First, CD38. This is highly expressed on immune cells, and it's something that breaks down NAD. One thing that I thought was interesting is the actual catalytic domain for CD38 can be on the outside of the cell as well as the inside. So I don't know, that's kind of interesting that the enzymatic activity, which makes sense for immune cells because they go around the body detecting, surveilling things, and they need to be able to take action. But anyway, that was just a side note. So with aging, inflammation tends to rise. That's inflammaging. So more immune activation could mean more CD38 and then more NAD plus breakdown. So that's one of the strongest mechanistic links that we have between aging and why NAD declines. Next is sirtuins. So sirtuins are NAD dependent deacetylases, and as NAD drops, sirtuin activity can drop. Sirtuins regulate mitochondrial health, metabolic switching, stress resilience. They're these longevity molecules. So less NAD, so that can contribute to this downward spiral of lower NAD, lower sirtuin, less resilience, more stress, more demand, a vicious cycle. And then we have PARP. PARPs are involved in DNA repair, and as we age, we have more DNA repair demand. So DNA damage and stress, meaning cellular stress, increase with age. Well, mental stress too. But PARP enzymes activate in response, and these consume NAD during this repair process. So as we have higher repair demand for our DNA, our NAD consumption increases as well. And finally, we have NNMT. This stands for nicotinamide N-methyltransferase. This can divert the building blocks of NAD away from recycling. So it basically pulls nicotinamide into a different pathway and reduces what's available to rebuild NAD. So you can think of NNMT as kind of a leak in that recycling system. And this typically is increased in people with obesity. So people with obesity could have a higher demand for NAD just because more of it's being broken down. All right, let's talk about the common side effects like fatigue, headaches, and energy crashes. Let's address what people report. So I see two common categories. We have the immediate symptoms of like headache, nausea, flushing, brain fog, and then we have the fatigue, wired but tired, poor sleep. So again, we don't have a huge body of research on NAD injections, especially with side effects. We do have reports of the IV, especially from the clinics, and these are very commonly reported side effects, especially fatigue. Now, what they do say is that it most likely goes away after a couple of infusions. So if it's something that you can handle sticking out with, I would recommend, giving it some time, but you don't want to suffer endlessly. So if it's not resolving, then probably, I would find another solution. But let's talk about the plausible explanation. So number one, maybe it's too much, too fast. If you deliver a big bolus of NAD quickly, your body may respond like it's handling a metabolic stressor. So some people can feel like amped and then crash, similar to how your body responds to caffeine. The second is autonomic nervous system response. So some people are just sensitive to shifts in like blood pressure, vasodilation, or nervous system activation. And this could show up as headaches, nausea, fatigue. And third is timing and sleep disruption. So if NAD injections are going to increase alertness, and they do in some people, doing it too late can interfere with sleep. And then obviously poor sleep is going to lead to fatigue and brain fog feeling the next day. So utilizing it earlier in the day, kind of like the way we would utilize coffee. I can't have coffee afternoon or I'm going to be up all night. Likewise with NAD, I keep it to the morning. Number 4 is histamine inflammation sensitivity. So some people have a higher baseline inflammation or mast cell tendencies, and they can be more reactive to certain peptides or interventions. I don't typically see this with NAD, but it's a plausible explanation as well. So it doesn't mean that NAD is bad. It's just that your system's more reactive, and maybe pushing it through IV or sub-Q or IM is not the right route for you. So how do we mitigate these? Well, again, not medical advice, just giving you some practical logic. Reduce the dose. I think a lot of people are going too quickly. Like they see, I don't know where the dosing is coming from if you're not going through a clinic, And clinics will tell you to start at 20 milligrams and very slowly walk your way up to 100. You don't need to get to 100. That's just the maximum. I don't know if people are just, going up to 100 out of the gate. And I would say that's probably not a smart thing to do. You want to just take it slow. Like, there's no need to rush this. Any amount is going to benefit you, and everybody's individual. So there's no reason to just, be he-man and push it to 100 right away. Some people that might be fine, but others might be sensitive. And then slowing down delivery. So this is more in the case of IV. Like, if you're pushing, you can always adjust the drip so that it's slower. You can also push it slower when you inject yourself. And then pushing it earlier in the day, of course, like I said, treat it like coffee, keep it before noon. And then very, very critical, I don't think people think about this because it's so basic, but hydration and electrolytes are super, super important, especially when we're pushing metabolic pathways like this. So we want to stay hydrated. Got your water bottle, like 2 liters of water a day, making sure you're getting electrolytes in there. Sodium, magnesium, potassium are critical for our cellular mechanism. So I can't understate that enough. I always tell people, like, make sure you're including your electrolytes, make sure you're staying hydrated, because a lot of times it's just the basics and you just forget. It's so simple that we just kind of forget about it. And then if side effects persist, you can always switch to oral precursors. Obviously, those are much better tolerated for most people, and that's a very valid option, very reasonable approach. If your body is saying no need to force it, just try another strategy. Now, who should consider NAD support? So my practical advice here is that the people most likely to benefit from NAD are typically midlife or older adults, people that have metabolic strain, people that are under chronic stress and inflammation, people focused on recovery, performance, or just healthy aging foundations. And then if you're young, metabolically healthy, you're sleeping well, you're training, and you're essentially thriving, then it might not be for you right now. I mean, I know a lot of the celebrities are doing it, and so it seems cool, but it's probably something that you can just hold off on until you need that support later in life. If you're young and healthy, you don't need anything fancy. Your body's already doing everything fine. It's making enough NAD. So you're just, kind of wasting money in a sense. And if someone has active cancer or is undergoing any type of treatment, then these NAD boosting decisions should be made with your clinician. It's not because NAD causes cancer, but cancer biology intersects with metabolism and cellular repair in very complex ways. Context matters, so just discuss it with your clinician, your oncologist, and see what their take on it is. So let's wrap it up. Okay, NAD is required for life because it's essential for energy and metabolism. It supports cellular repair and resilience pathways. And NAD declines with age because the demand increases. So we have inflammation, we have CD38 from our immune system declining, inflammaging, and immunosenescence. We have increased DNA repair demand. We have PARP activation for the DNA repair, which is going to deplete NAD. And then we have differences in recycling shifts. And we also have the NNMT enzyme that can break down NAD. And that's more in the context of obesity. But these are all reasons why our demand is increasing in particular situations like aging or obesity or inflammation. And then we have NR, NMN, and niacin as precursors. They have well-established published literature, human data, very well tolerated, very good outcomes. So I love them. I'm not against them at all. And then we have NAD injections. They have less clinical evidence. They do make biological sense through that salvage pathway. So both are very valid tools. And as I always say, the smartest approach is going to be the one that works for you. What we essentially are trying to do is lower the burn rate, which is through supporting inflammation pathways, metabolic pathways, and healthy aging, and then support the rebuilding as well. And that's what we're doing with either the precursors or the NAD injections. So whichever one works for you is the right option. There's no right or wrong. But that's it for today. So let me know what you think in the comments. Which is your favorite method? Did you learn anything new? Any questions that you still have that I can answer? I'd love to hear that from you. And in the description, you'll find other places that you can find me. So until next time.